Welcome, friends. If we have anybody watching, that is. I'm your host of Cinematic Realms, John Webster, and with me, as always,
Jared Kozel, happy to be here.
I hope you guys are doing well tonight, whether you come in and watch live or watch later. This may not be one of the more higher viewed streams because I know this is more of a I think we joked a few streams ago about how one of the streams was like one for us.
That would have been the Banshees of Inisherin.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so same thing here. Not as many people have actually seen the film Hugo as I would like, especially within our circle. But hey, maybe we caused a couple people here and there to check the movie out.
And one of those people was me, as we will talk.
Hello, Stephanie. Thank you for joining us. Great to see you. So Jared, this is one that we've been talking about for a while, and you hadn't seen the film, and you said, I'll go ahead and watch it. We decided we're gonna do this. You know, I've suggested a couple, you've suggested some, and we're going to we're testing the waters to make sure that we can do this, and the other person at least is going to, give it an honest go and not come back with oh my God, I hated this movie. But I didn't think that would happen with this one, but you never know. And Mother Roy, like,
you
both
know the way right to our hearts with this.
Thank you for joining us, and really, that just starts the stream off on such a wonderful note. Makes me feel bad. I almost wore my Elizabeth Swann T-shirt today, but I went Star Wars instead. But as we all know, Star Wars Episode 1 is the Star Wars film that has Keira Knightley in it. So
yes,
so close enough. Anyway, before we veered too far off track. And also welcome to the one and only Thinkerbell. Thank you for tuning in. Yeah, I'm glad to see some people have seen the film, because even though it's by a very acclaimed director, but it is one of his, I feel like, his underrated gems. I remember when the Oscar nominations came out, and that year it was all about the artist. And then the Oscar nominations came out, and the movie with the most number of nominations was Hugo. And I remember watching like coverage on like Good Morning America and stuff like that, and people were like, "What's Hugo?" It's like, it's only the new Martin Scorsese film.
I will say that particular Best Picture lineup had quite a few films that not a lot of people, I think, had seen in the wider world. That when Terrence Malick gets nominated for Best Picture, then that things are getting a little bit more esoteric.
I have two things to say. One, I don't know his name, but I will forever loathe the Academy president for that year, because when Terrence Malick's name was called either for Best Picture or the Best Director lineup for the nominations, he rolled his eyes. And it just made me so furious.
That's bad.
Yeah. And the other thing about Hugo was also just a random thing to go along with the fact that some people didn't even know about the film, was that even the people who like swore they knew about it and were writing up like Oscar coverage were saying like, and the animated film Hugo scored 11 nominations. It's like, animated? What are you talking about? Because that was also the year that The Adventures of Tintin was out, and I think they had gotten them confused. And and in fairness, like the poster for the film, like does kind of evoke a CG animated movie. So like I'm gonna give them that. You know, there's a little bit of that going on. I don't think the promotion for this film was that great. I don't think they knew how to market it because you know, from a studio's point of view, you market it as like a kid's movie, but really it's, you know, it's a love letter to cinema and to the filmmaker George Méliès. And how do you market that as, you know, what they wanted to do as a kids movie, which and it is to a certain degree, you know, a movie for kids as well. But it's so much more than that. And I just don't know. I don't think they knew what to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you may mention this, or you definitely mentioned it in the description on the stream. This is actually based on a children's book titled The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which I actually believe was the original title of the movie, because I remember hearing that Martin Scorsese was going to direct a movie called The Invention of Hugo Cabret, but then at some point in the lead up to its release, the title changed and it just became Hugo. And I think it's because they probably thought that was easier to market, but it's still a tricky film to sell, as you said. I remember watching the trailer for this movie. I was like, I don't really get what this movie is about. And that's not to say the movie doesn't have incredibly clear themes and the like. It's just they're hard to fit into a 2-minute trailer, particularly for a director like Martin Scorsese, who general audiences have an idea of what to expect from a Martin Scorsese movie. So you can put his name in the title, but as we will get into, this is a very different kind of movie for him. So,
yeah, I said on the last stream, I feel like there's two Martin Scorseses. There's gangster Martin Scorsese, and there's like love of cinema Martin Scorsese, which is not to say his gangster movies don't, you know, drip his love of cinema, but he has another side to him, which is like films like Hugo, but also The Age of Innocence, The Aviator, which is one of my personal favorites of his, that just have a different flavor to them.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's the stream will be the tale of two Scorseses, because I know for a lot of people, they know him, like you say Scorsese and you're like Goodfellas.
What's interesting about that is, you know.
Hi, Sanri. So great to see you. Thank you for dropping by. That means a lot. Sorry, go ahead, Jared. What were you saying? Oh, did you freeze up? I thought you were being contemplative. Jared, if you can hear me, you've frozen up.
Sorry, we had some technical difficulties there.
I thought you, well, because I thought you had just gotten contemplative and you were like staring down at something. I was.
Oh no, my screen went completely black for a second, and I realized that my computer wasn't plugged in, and I was like, I'm gonna need to fix that before otherwise we are gonna cut to black permanently during this stream. But so you were talking about Martin Scorsese's filmography and how this is a different kind of movie for him. And there's like two different Martin Scorseses. I do think that like that is a kind of an easy dynamic to split into, but just because I do want to acknowledge, for instance, he also does a lot of documentaries, which I have not seen as many of those. To be honest, you know, a lot. Even for such an acclaimed director, my familiarity with a lot of Martin Scorsese's filmography could use some work. I must admit I have not seen a lot of his earlier films. I have not checked out Boxcar Bertha. But I would say that for a lot of people, and it is kind of unfair, when a director gets famous, and particularly when they're an acclaimed director they're very good at one thing, and in Scorsese's case, with films like Raging Bull and Goodfellas that have a very specific tone, it people want to put them in a box just because it's easier to categorize them that way. And that's really not fair because, you know, someone like Martin Scorsese, being one of the most talented filmmakers to ever live, really should not be put in any kind of box. He should be able to make any kind of movies he wants to make. And it just so happens that a movie like Hugo is particularly distinctive in his filmography because he hasn't really made any movies specifically like this one, at least that I've seen. And from what I understand of people who are much more familiar with his filmography, this is really kind of an outlier for him. But as you mentioned earlier, how successful it was with the Academy Awards, you know, that doesn't make it lesser. In fact, it's a great, you know, testament to his talents that he was able to take a movie that is based on a children's book and have it make a movie that is very friendly for children and families, but as you also know, has deeper ideas going on, not least of which is a tribute to early cinema and the filmmaker George Méliès. Which, yes, I'm glad you put up this picture just because I noticed that in some of your earlier streams that, like, when you were talking about like love of the movies and things, this was the photo that you used for the thumbnail. And when we got to this scene in this movie, when I was watching, I'm like, there it is.
It's funny because I actually the stream that I used for the thumbnail for was when or I don't know if I used it for the thumbnail, but I know I popped it up as a graphic. It was when AR came on to be my co-host. And so I had like up above the two of them, I'm pointing at it, you can't see, but it said Cinematic Realms with John and Amy at the time is what it said. And it was just so fitting for me just because this movie just sort of personifies my love of cinema. It's one of those movies that like just makes you feel the love of the art form. I know another film that does that for a lot of people, which I haven't seen, is Cinema Paradiso, which I've got to correct one of these days and check it out. But this is that movie for me. And like the only regret that I have about doing the stream today is that I wish I felt this way watching it today. Like I wish you had gotten a chance to see this in the cinemas in 3D, because there is like, it's so intrinsic to, not that like, I think the movie is superb and the cinematography is gorgeous, but it's a completely different animal in 3D just because it's so immersive. But yeah, hopefully one day for an anniversary or something, they'll put it back out in theaters.
Yeah, I was going to say 3D films seem to have kind of fallen out of fashion with the exception of James Cameron's Avatar films. And truth be told, like going forward, I would welcome the opportunity to see a movie like this in 3D because I can tell that is the format for which it was designed. But I have to be honest, back when this movie came out in 2011, one of the reasons that I didn't go out and see it was because it was in 3D.
And it's such a shame because this is like, I think this is the best argument for the format, this film. And it was probably the outside of, and even Avatar, like I think Avatar still works pretty well in 2D, but there's no question that was made for 3D. But this film it was done with such an artistic like eye and mind. There's so many shots, and it feels simplistic to say shots because like the whole movie feels like when you see it in 3D, it's like you're moving through the station with Hugo, and there's this beautiful moment towards the end of the film when we're seeing like a bunch of Méliès films, projected on a screen, and and the rest of the movie, you see those movies as they were in like 2 dimensions. But for that scene, they turn the films into 3D, and that final shot of the man in the moon like coming out is in 3D and like comes out to the audience.
Yeah.
And it was just so amazing and cool. And yeah, there's just, I think Scorsese really did something with 3D that no other director, to be honest, not even James Cameron had done. So yeah, it's a bummer that I know everything was in 3D. Everything was like, it was so oversaturated. I totally get that. But
Yeah.
It was an experience to be treasured.
Yeah, and I think the delineating line for me was that I do regret not seeing it in 3D now, because this was a movie like the Avatar films that was actually. Oh, thank you, Sandrine. That means a lot. I'm very happy and honored to be on John's channel. Although I echo Cassie's earlier point about missing AR. They'll be back. They'll be back at some point. You know, they've got things going on. They're busy. But they're doing well. Yeah. So what I was going to say was just this movie and the Avatar films were actually designed and created and shot with 3D in mind. And I think what put me off 3D was that to capitalize on the extra $5 you could charge for a ticket in those days, a lot of studios took movies that were shot were 2D and converted them to 3D. I have vivid memories of seeing Up in 3D, which there was no reason to do that, because Up is a lovely film in 2D in its own right. And I was just like, why would you do this? But in this movie, it works on multiple levels to have it be in 3D, not just because there are specific scenes that are clearly designed to be seen in that format, including the opening sequence, but there's actually kind of a nice thematic parallel in there's a recurring element throughout the movie of, one of the things that entrances George Méliès when he first sees the moving pictures is one of the very first moving pictures of train pulls into the station, and the idea that, when audiences first saw this new format, they ducked and they screamed because they felt like the train was actually coming through the screen right at them. And they actually play with that in this movie, not only in terms of as a recurring idea of the fascination it can bring, but also they do similar shots. And of course they have the kind of the nightmare sequence where the train actually does come crashing through the station. So it's a clever motif, and it's a way of me saying that this movie, like having just watched it in 2D, I think it holds up very well narratively, but I do see why visually it would be better to experience it in its intended format.
I'm so glad that you picked up on that, the parallels and stuff, because I wondered if some of that might be lost without the scene in 3D. There was such a feeling of when I saw this for the first time, because you're right, 3D was feeling like a very gimmicky at this point. Not so much when we all went to go see Avatar and we were mesmerized by it, but immediately after that, like the studios were converting 2D movies into 3D, and it just immediately was like, oh God, I'm sick of this already. But with this film, it was done with such intent that Scorsese clearly is drawing the line between like the old, revolutionary, method of cinema and the future of cinema, where it's going in these days, and to leave audiences feeling like they've been through some kind of an experience, and that's illustrated by, as you said, with the moving train, film, and that so closely parallels what 3D does, and so it made it feel like it was an evolution of the art form. And and it was just really great to see, especially like I said, with the seconds of the last sequence of the movie where you actually see Méliès's films in 3D, and you can't help but feel like, yeah, I think Méliès would have been on board with this, because it's exactly the type of, you know, thing that he was going for. And also I do want to say, as a side note, what I love about this movie and Méliès and his, you know, the films he was making, is that this is a movie that celebrates a filmmaker who loved making movies that a lot of people nowadays thumb their nose at. Like, he was making fantastical, like, spectacles with, you know, traveling to other planets, and, you know, walking skeletons, and, you know, all this stuff. It reminds me of the fact that the old stories, like eons ago, where you had stuff like Beowulf, that's from like the earliest days, and the fact that these are the stories that started storytelling in any medium, and it seems like we so quickly, you know, become dismissive of that, and I love that this movie celebrates that, in fact.
Yeah, no, and it's a great undertone that, in addition to telling its story, which any movie that is going to be a tribute or love letter to cinema, it can't just be like, look how great all this is. It needs to have its own underlying emotional story, which Hugo very much does. But what's cool about it in that other respect is, you know, I had heard the name George Méliès before, but it wasn't until I watched this movie and started reading about this movie that I really appreciated, like, just how entrenched he was with the beginning of modern cinema as we understand it. And one of the things that really crystallized it for me is that image that becomes a recurring and very important image throughout this movie of the man in the moon with his, you know, the rocket in his eye, which is an image that I probably saw when I was like 5 or 6 years old. And I had no idea where it was from. You know, I certainly didn't know who George Méliès was at that time, but it's such an evocative image that it really, you know, it goes to show, as you point out, like, what a depth of imagination this guy had, and how his visions and ability to, as he wants to say, you know, this is where dreams are made. Like, this is actually, like, you know, we owe him a great debt, because without him, like, who knows how long it would have taken for other artists to realize the potential of movies and cinematic art, and specifically the kind of, like, fantastical movies that we love, you know, that have, like, that aren't just depicting, say, you know, a day in the life, but are also depicting new worlds and, you know, strange creatures and fantastical adventures. And this movie, like, honors that in its spirit, while also, you know, telling us the story of the actual man through the eyes of this, you know, young boy and girl who go on an adventure of their own.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because obviously the big thing you walk away from this movie with is the tribute that it pays George Méliès, but I think that this movie is also incredibly successful, as the first half of the movie is very much like a sort of Dickensian, you know, story with the mystery and, you know, and all this, and, you know, orphans, and, you know, and sort of larger than life characters, like, you know, the character that Sacha Baron Cohen plays, the station inspector. I love him in this.
He's great, and it's a very that was another thing when, you know, just speaking to the times, the idea of when I saw him pop up in this movie playing the station inspector in the trailer, of course, my cinematically at that time not quite as literate brain was like, Borat, what's he doing in the movie?
But he is such a talented actor.
Oh, he's great. Yeah,
I love him in both this and around a couple of years before, he had a a small role in Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, and he was great in that too. I feel like, people just, at first glance, they're just like, yeah, Borat, and but he's so much more than that. And oh my God, I will never forget the year he presented at the Academy Awards. He was presenting the clip from, or maybe it was either the Academy Awards or maybe it was the Golden Globes, and he was introducing Les Miserables, which was nominated for Best Musical or Comedy, and he's going through all these little facts and figures about the movie, and and he talks about oh God, what company was it? Oh, let's say it was Universal. Universal paid such and such to give Russell Crowe, so many, so long a time in singing lessons. And he says, yeah, that was money well spent. He's just like, and of course, he worked on the movie too, so it was all in good fun. But no, I love him. He's great. But yeah, I just, oh yeah. And Cassie sent me a message where she was like, John, you didn't really have to sell me on this movie, but you could have told me that there were lots of dogs.
always a selling point for any movie, provided that the dogs turn out okay, which in this movie they do. So
yeah. I wish I don't think I have any images of the dogs themselves, which, that's such a shame. But yeah, the station inspector has his dog who, spends some close time with him, I think they share a bath at one point. And then there's, of course, we've got some characters like, and that's what's great. The movie is populated with like side characters who have their own little story. Like you have the older couple who, are romancing each other, and
you mean Vernon Dursley and Madame Maxine?
Yeah, exactly.
Or Richard Griffiths and Frances Latour, if we're gonna treat them as the actors they are.
I smiled so much, especially seeing Richard Griffiths, just because he passed away a number of years ago, but I have such fond memories of, like, as despicable as he was, but we all love to hate Mr. Dursley, and and it's a cute story, between the two of them, and how he, then he gets a dog just so that her dog will stop attacking him.
Yeah. And possibly other motivations as well,
Yes.
Well, some.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'll make sure next time there are dogs, I will make sure especially to grab pictures of said dogs. Yeah, no, you what was I thinking? You can't have a stream about a movie that so heavily features dogs and not bring the pictures. It's a terrible sin. I do apologize.
But yeah, just I actually think a good way from the point where you were talking about like all those little those side characters that have their own stories in the movie in the form of Richard Griffiths, Monsieur Frick, and Frances Latour's Madame Emile. The fact this movie, even though it mostly takes place in just one or two locations, with the primary one being the train station. Oh, look, there are the dogs.
Oh yeah.
Still not Maximilian, Sacha Baron Cohen's character's dog, but perhaps.
But I'm redeemed a little bit.
Yeah, yes. But just it's an interesting idea of the that. This movie it's not a one location movie, but it does have a very central hub in the form of the train station and the characters who effectively inhabit it. And in the case of Hugo, literally inhabit it, like living within its walls. And the like really makes it feel like a far more expansive and wide-reaching world than you would think a train station would be, and that's part of the magic of it. Honestly, is that the way that Martin Scorsese chooses to shoot it, the way he brings the camera with those like 3D inspired shots, like swooping through the walls and through the machines and to the clock tower. And through all the shops and along the train, like that's part of what makes this movie feel so vibrant and alive, even though it's the adventure is very much confined mostly to those walls and then a few other locations and time frames, including like flashbacks and memory. But that was something I was very impressed with about it, because I found that sometimes movies that are set in a single location, like, or have that kind of stagecraft, I can bump up against it a little bit. At some point when we continue our Knights of Kira discussions, we're going to talk about Anna Karenina, which I believe I mentioned this when we did our Knights of Kira stream a couple years ago. Like, I really do love that movie, but one of the things I really bumped up against it the first time I watched it was the fact that they decided to set it on a single stage and have characters like shuffle in and shuffle out, and that I know it's great. It really, really took me out of it the first time I watched the movie, and I really needed a second and third watch to appreciate it. This movie, I didn't need that. This movie, I was like, I really loved the way they used the production.
I have to resist turning this into an Anna Karenina discussion.
Well, Kathleen would never forgive us, so I'm sorry I even brought it up.
But side note, I will say that I love the movie for that reason, because it has such a clear delineation between which parts of the movie are set on a stage, and it's saying something about the Russian aristocracy with that. And then when characters leave the stage and go out into the real locations, I think it's very purposeful, and I love the scenes when you have like the stagehands carrying around stuff, because I think it's like a stage production brought into the filmic world. But I gotta stop myself.
It sounds like we need to talk about Anna Karenina, John, and Atonement too. Complete the Joe Wright trilogy. But I say all that. I brought that up specifically to say that one of the 5 Oscars that this movie won was for art direction, which has now been retitled production design at the ceremony. But like when I see it, I'm like, oh yeah. I see why this movie won this going away. This is like phenomenal set design, and it really it enhances the story in the way that they use the way the sets and the way the camera moves through them to tell its story in a way that not every movie does. So I was very impressed with that aspect of the movie, among others.
Yeah, for me, it'll always be best art direction, just because I've memorized every category that Return of the King won. Yeah. Like, I've watched the clips a million times, and back then it was best art direction, so that's what it'll always be. But no, I'm just going to read off it won best art direction, best cinematography, best sound editing, best sound mixing, which are now only one award. That's another light thing I could gripe about, and best visual effects. And it was also nominated for best original score by Maestro Howard Shore, which we'll talk about as well. Best film editing, best costume design, best cinematography, best adapted screenplay, best director Martin Scorsese, and of course best picture of the year. If I could actually complain out of 11 nominations, I would say that I think it was a shame that Ben Kingsley was not nominated for Best Supporting Actor, because he's just utterly magnificent. But that's like me complaining that Return of the King, it only won 11 Oscars. Should have been nominated for cinematography and supporting actor too.
I think we can agree that The Lord of the Rings was underrepresented in the acting categories. And whenever we get to talking about Sir Ben Kingsley, he You're right. It is a wonderful performance in this movie, which is filled with great performances, including two great performances by child actors, which is a thing that really could have, hurt the movie if those performances weren't at, up to the same level. But Asa Butterfield and the awesome Chloe Grace Moretz are astounding as the leads of this movie.
Which I think this was actually the first thing I had seen her in, because I had not yet seen Kick-Ass, which is what a lot of people knew her from. And I saw that after. I was like, oh, no wonder she made a splash. And what's funny is that she lied to Scorsese and told him that she was British, because he wanted an all-British cast. And then at some point during the filming, she dropped her accent, and and there was a little moment of him being like, "Hey, wait a second."
No, but it's convincing. She does a good job with it. The first thing I ever saw Chloe Grace Moretz in, I believe, was 500 Days of Summer, where she played the kind of the smart aleck younger sister of the main character there. And I doubt you have seen this but she is wonderful in the movie Let Me In, which is the vampire movie that's a remake of the Swedish vampire movie. She plays the vampire in the question, and it's an awesome performance. That's actually a Matt Reeves movie. It's great. I actually was thinking about rewatching that one after I watched this, but this is a very different performance. It's she in this movie, like, she was honestly a highlight for me in this movie. Just like the energy that she brought, the vibrancy. I loved her little affectation of just constantly using bigger words than she needs to and more words than she needs to, including circumlocution, which means using too many words.
There's a specific moment that I just love from her. It's when she says, "And I think we should be very clandestine." So great. She got I remember reading the reviews for this movie, and she got a lot of praise for this, as you would expect. I think Asa Butterfield is absolutely wonderful as well. I mean, he broke my heart several times during this movie. One of my, I think the point where I remember being completely locked into this movie, because I was being wowed by it visually, and I was very into the movie. But it's the part in the movie where they discover that she has the key around her neck that she needs, and they get the automaton to work, and it stops working after a second before it eventually picks up again and finishes the drawing. But it's like he's just slumps in the chair and talks about how he thought if he could get it to work, then he wouldn't be so lonely. And then it's followed up by the excitement of once it starts working again, and then she goes, "It's not done, Hugo. It's not done." And there's such excitement, in that moment. And again, let's write down how many times I'm going to praise Howard Shore. But his music for that sequence, it's just so puts a lump in your throat. It gets you excited. And I will say, speaking of the music, Howard Shore had worked with Martin Scorsese a number of times in throughout the 2000s. But each time, he worked with him a bit on Gangs of New York, writing some underscore for the movie, because there were a lot of weird musical choices made in the final cut of that movie. We have the awful man from Miramax to thank for that.
Don't speak his name, please.
Yeah, I'm not. And then with The Aviator, he was the composer on that film as well. But there was a lot of period music used for that. So Shore's music didn't get to really, it was very good, but it didn't get it wasn't front and center. Hugo is the movie where finally, like, there certainly is some period music in there, but his score is like front and center, and it gets to shine. And I think it's one of his finest scores, and it's probably my favorite score of his after Lord of the Rings. I just think it's beautiful.
That's high praise indeed.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit? Oh, yes. So do we want to talk a little bit about the setup for this movie? Just because you said that like not a lot of people may have seen it, so maybe we should set the stage a little bit, or set the station.
People know that it's about, it's about love of cinema, and there's some child actors, and apparently there's some kind of metal man involved. May not like, but the movie starts off where we meet Hugo. He's winding the clocks in the train station that the film is set in, and we learn through a flashback, which is very cleverly done with the a flashing light and the sound of a film projector in the back, as we then see the flashback that he and his father discovered this, what it's called, an automaton, which they were working on fixing together. Unfortunately, and of course, his father is played by the magnificent Jude Law, who for some reason I thought he showed up more in this movie than he actually does, but he's literally only in like a 2-minute flashback, and that's all we get of him. But I will take any amount of Jude Law. His father unfortunately dies in a fire at the museum that he works at. And then Hugo is taken by his just wonderful uncle, who doesn't have any like ulterior motives in taking his nephew. He's just a nice guy. Yeah.
He loves the spirits. He's full. He's always full of the holiday spirits.
But his job is winding the clocks at the train station, making sure that everything keeps working. And so he takes Hugo, to keep him out of the orphanage. But as a side benefit, he's going to help him do the work, or just do the work. At some point, we can surmise that his Uncle Claude has left. We find out later on in the movie what's become of him. And so Hugo is left to winding the clocks in the station on his own. And, all the while continuing to repair the automaton, for which he is stealing parts here and there. And then he ends up, getting caught stealing parts from, this toy shop owner played by Sir Ben Kingsley, who catches him in the act, and takes his father's notebook, which had drawings of the automaton and how it worked and all that. And so then this all gets started off where he takes the notebook. Hugo wants the notebook back, and without getting into all the details of the story as it unfolds, that's how their relationship begins. And the, and of course through that he ends up meeting
Isabel,
and then the whole story kind of flowers from there. It's about him trying to get the notebook back, but also trying to discover the secret of getting the automaton to work, which then unfolds to lead into discovering more mystery about Papa George, as he's known, which leads us to discovering that he is in fact George Méliès, the filmmaker.
Yeah,
and it's. And then I'm stopping myself from continuing on in exact plot details because I could just describe this entire movie because I love the way the story unfolds, but I want to make sure we don't get caught up in recapping.
Well, I mean, it's. I think it's good that you set the stage with all that, because we mentioned that while this movie is a love letter to cinema and to George Méliès in particular, it isn't just a, hagiography of the man. It is telling a story, and of which that celebration is an element. And Georges Méliès, while an incredibly important character, is not the main character of this movie. Hugo, the titular character, is.
Yes.
And Hugo specifically has a different, emotional motivation that really drives through the plot. He stumbles upon the identity of Georges Méliès and his filmography almost by accident. There are certain coincidences that lead you to believe it was almost destiny that these two would meet. But at the start of the movie, Hugo's primary motivation is to, essentially establish a reconnection with his lost father in the form of an idea that he believes that his father may have left him a message in this automaton, and he wants to get it to work so that he can unlock that message, and as you pointed out in that wonderful scene later in the movie, perhaps feel a little bit less alone.
Yes.
But and he also has a secondary motivation of wanting to stay free and living in the train station so he can continue to do that work and not get caught by Sacha Baron Cohen's Inspector Gustave and sent to the orphanage, which they never show us, but is very clearly implied to be a terrible place for children, particularly in this era. So that makes him a very scrappy yet sympathetic protagonist, even though as Papa George notes very indignantly early in the movie, he's a little thief. But he's doing it for the right reasons. He's it's not quite Robin Hood, which we get a nod to that in the form of the book that Isabel shows and the one that Hugo responds to. He's not stealing from the rich, because Papa George is very decidedly not rich, and he's not giving to the poor. He's taking these parts for a very specific idea, but there's an underlying emotional, like, there's a just cause to what he's doing that makes us feel like, what, we're on this kid's side. We want to see him, not even just go on this adventure, but just manage to reconnect with his father. And of course, as the wonderful monologue at the end of the movie kind of hints, and I'm not actually sure if that's a passage taken from the book. It kind of sounds like it might be, but basically the idea of this young boy who lives in a train station, goes on this adventure, wants to reconnect to his father, and in doing so, he finds his way home, which is, such a lovely idea, because that's ultimately what he was really looking for with his, wanting to unlock the message in the automaton. And in the process, he finds a new family. He finds Isabel, and he finds Papa George and Mama John, and in the process actually heals Papa George as well. So,
which, by the way, I do want to give props also to, that's our first mention of Mama Jean and the wonderful Helen McCrory, who we have also lost, sadly. She is just wonderful in this movie. Another Harry Potter alumni. She's much nicer than this. But yeah, no, it's so beautiful. And what's interesting about what I love about Ben Kingsley's performance is that early on in the movie, without exactly knowing what he's gone through, who he is, he's very mean to poor Hugo, but it's because this is a man who has gone through a lot of pain in his life, and he's just so terribly sad. And that pain is something, it's a different kind of pain, but that's something that the two of them share. Hugo is going through grief, losing his father, and I was actually very glad that this movie didn't. I was able to just become enraptured in the story that I was watching rather than reflect on, things that have happened in my life over the past couple of years. Just sometimes this kind of thing about movies about grief and losing a parent, can be a bit triggering, especially since I've so recently lost my mom. But thankfully, I was so wrapped up in Hugo's story that thankfully it wasn't painful to watch. It was just, any more than his story was painful to think about when I first saw the film. It's, when you're lost, you're just looking for that connection. And that's very, drawing parallels, like, when I did lose my mom and I was even before she was gone, I was looking to connect with people. And so I found like our friend group and, Here Be Dragons and all that. And so you just don't want to be alone. And which is what Hugo says, in that scene I talked about earlier, where he just, thought he wouldn't feel so alone. And that's like, we can all sympathize with that. And that's why I think, Hugo as a character resonates so much. He's just looking for a home and for people to love and to love him back.
Yeah, no, absolutely well said. And in a similar vein, I actually, because Cassie had that comment in the chat about some of the movie's other themes about, it's also about imagination and passion and talent. Hugo's talent and passion for mechanics, Isabel's passion and way of working with words and narratives. Yes, absolutely, all of that. And it ties back to the theme that you mentioned about, family and connection and wanting to, and also purpose, lost purpose, because that's the wound that it lies at the heart of Georges Méliès, is that he found what he was, his great passion in life, what he was meant to do. And then thanks to circumstances beyond his control, he couldn't do it anymore. The Great War effectively destroyed his dreams. And there are the two wonderful quotes that Isabel has, or that Hugo has when he's speaking to Isabel later in the movie, specifically when they're standing at the top of the clock tower and they're looking out at the city, and Hugo has that speech about imagining the whole world as one big machine and there not being any extra parts. They always come with the exact amount they need. So if I figured if the entire world was one big machine, I couldn't be an extra part. I had to be here for some reason. And that means that you have to be here for some reason too, which in this case, Isabel, was wondering what her own purpose is. And it's not explicitly answered, but it seems kind of implied that her purpose is going to be a storyteller and a writer, because at the end of the movie, she is writing down Hugo's own story. And there's a kind of a dark side to the idea of, purpose and machines having a purpose, when Hugo mentions that, when a machine breaks, when it's unable to do the job that it can't do, that it was designed to do, he says, maybe that's why a broken machine always makes me a little sad, because it isn't able to do what it was meant to do. Maybe it's the same with people. If you lose your purpose, it's like you're broken.
It's amazing how this movie hits at different points in my life, because when this first came out in 2011, I was very determined to carve my path into, getting into the film industry. And, I had ideas about how to accomplish that. And so this movie was very inspiring in that way. Now that part of it makes me a little sad because so much has happened in the intervening years, and I'm not quite, I'm fortunate that I get to come on here each week and talk about my love of movies, but I also, there's a huge part of me that feels that I'm not necessarily doing what I want to do, and because of things that have transpired in my life, this isn't me going for pity or anything, but I do feel a bit broken, at times, and so it does, feel like I struggle to find my purpose in that way, and here's hoping that in another, another 10 years or so, I'll, look back at this movie again and say, I got fixed. I found my purpose. And, but it's such a wonderfully evocative, idea and theme. I loved it when I first saw this movie, and I still love it now, because, and this idea that, what he says about the world is one big machine, then you're not an extra part. I do like that, because I think we can feel that way in our lives a bit. And I also like the implication that if you do feel broken, maybe it's your loved ones that can help fix you. And I've been feeling a lot of that between, like, you guys, between my in my family back in Maryland, and it's it's so there's a lot of that. Didn't mean to make this episode my session on the therapy couch, but there you have it. But yeah, I think thematically it's very beautiful, and I think that Asa Butterfield just knocks that stuff out of the park. I think he gives such a beautiful performance, and I love at the end, like, I guess it's okay that we're jumping all around. We've been doing that anyway. We typically do. And I love at the end when he actually says, well, wait a minute, to Sacha Baron Cohen's station inspector. And he was, and he talked about, this is my only chance to work. You should understand. And, and the fact that, the station inspector also is broken in a literal sense. He's got his injury from the war, but also he's had his own difficulties in life beyond that. He went to the orphanage, and, there's a lot of stuff in his past that kind of, and he's, we don't know for certain, but it looks like he's on the right path to, becoming, a better person, maybe being fixed himself by, at the end of the movie, by reaching out or having others reach out to him, and having the courage to actually engage with other people instead of being on his own, as he says he was taught to be.
Yeah. No, and that kind of speaks to one of the reasons that's so strong and so resonant, is because it speaks to the movie's themes. When you talk about us jumping around, part of the reason that we do that is because I find it more interesting to track the thematic through lines of the movie, rather than the narrative through lines, because the plot of the movie is, it flows. It's a great story, but just recounting it beat by beat is not always the most interesting way to approach it. We try to identify the ideas that are driving the plot and tie the story back through them. And in the case of Sacha Baron Cohen's inspector character, he is the closest thing probably that this movie has to an antagonist. It's in the sense that for a long portion of the movie, he wants to send Hugo to the terrible orphanage, and he could have very easily just been that. He could have just been a very villainous, character, very much the kind of the rat catcher mentality of the one who, the guy who rounds up the street urchins and sends them away. But in this case, they actually give him a very complicated and thoughtful backstory. And the reason you cast an actor as great as Sacha Baron Cohen to play him is so that he can hint at those moments of tragedy and loneliness throughout the movie and help you understand this man who, as we learn, was an orphan himself and grew up at the orphanage and learned lessons there, not necessarily the right lessons, but the idea that, yes, you can be tough and resilient, but also that means you don't need family, which is obviously was the wrong lesson to learn. And then he goes to the war, which probably wasn't his choice. He gets permanently, injured there. He wears a brace on his legs now that he can barely walk without. And it turns him into kind of broken machine as well, because throughout the movie there's that little affectation that his brace doesn't totally work. It constantly locks up on him at the inopportune moment, and you can tell that he's lost. He's searching for something, not just the fact that he has a crush on the lovely flower girl Lizette, played by the equally lovely Emily Mortimer, but the idea that he clearly doesn't know how to talk to her, and it's not just the fact that he, doesn't have that quite experience. It's that he feels like, how could anyone love me or want me, given the fact that I'm broken, that that I have this injury, that I can't provide, the kind of life that this woman might want. And as we find out, it's really just a matter of the idea that he is scared to take that chance, and he almost, blows it, because he has that moment where he actually has started to warm her heart a little bit, and then he leaves that alone so that he can go chase Hugo and throw him in a cage. And it's a moment where he effectively is tempted by the dark side of, his childhood trauma. He needs to lock that part of himself away. But fortunately, because he is human, because he isn't just a, monstrous antagonist, they're able to get through to him. And so as a result, he saves Hugo's life. He is moved by Papa George's speech. He lets Hugo go, and then he gets the girl, and he gets his leg fixed. So he gets his own happy ending, And he has his good boy Maximilian with him the whole way. So ultimately, Inspector Gustave did all right.
A couple of notes before we go into the mid-roll. I do want to say, first of all, I first saw Emily Mortimer in the film The Ghost in the Darkness. Actually, she has she plays Val Kilmer's wife, and a small part, but I remember her from that. And then she's been in a number of things over the years, and she was in the HBO series The Newsroom, which I actually was quite fond of her in that. And what was the other thing I was jumping? You mentioned the scene where he takes Hugo and puts him in the cage. It's towards the end of the movie. That scene wowed me in 3D, because you can it still happens in the 2D version, but there's a moment where he's on the phone and he's turning his head and his hat catches the light. And when you see that in 3D, you're almost blinded by it. And it's just so great, because it creates just that kind of 3D effect you want, where it feels like real life. And then I think there was something else. It'll come back to me. But
well, hopefully it will in the next few seconds. But since you just brought that scene up, I did want to mention one of my favorite little moments that did not need to be in the movie, but it's just fantastic, is the little bromance that he has with the policeman over the phone, and played by Kevin Eldon, who was in Game of Thrones, famous British comedian. But the fact that he calls him up, and then they get to talking about their personal problems, and the fact that it's like, my wife left me and she's pregnant and we haven't had relations in over a year. That's odd. And then he hands him the photo, and he's like, "You sure you want her back?" Which is mean spirited, but it's a fun little underlying development that's like, these two guys have this little little bromance going on. Everyone needs a friend. And even if that friend is a horrible, policeman who's parting children off the orphanage.
Well, it's stuff like that makes this, this world feel so alive. Even as you were saying, it's smaller. It's mostly confined to the train station and a few other places, but everything just feels so alive and vibrant with all these, even a character like that, has his own little story, there. And I love Sacha Baron Cohen's response to that, where he's like, well, when's the last time you had relations? Been in the past year? No. Oh, that is suspicious. Yeah, I just love the way he plays it. Oh, okay. I remember what I was going to say. It's the moment where he finds out that Claude's been dead, and you just see him in the bathtub, and you think he's just talking to himself, and it's like, if he is deceased, then who has been winding the clocks? And then it cuts just to the dog, and then it cuts to the wide shot where you see the dog is right in front of him in the tub.
And he's fully clothed in the bathtub, which just makes the whole scene even more ridiculous. But that Maximilian's a sharp one. I'm sure he's got the answers that we seek.
Yeah. Oh God. Okay, let's do the mid roll, and then we'll go back into it. Thank you everyone who's tuned in for this discussion. I was a bit worried it might just be us, but I'm happy to see a couple fans of the movies, and thank you everybody for tuning in. We're not over. It sounds like I'm winding down. We're still going.
We're halfway.
So coming up next week, we're going to have a guest on the channel. We're going to have our good friend Erin joining us, and we're going to be doing a long overdue stream about the film The Mask of Zorro with Antonio Banderas, Anthony Hopkins, and Catherine Zeta-Jones. Erin and I were meant to do this discussion like early last year, and then Guardians of the Galaxy 3 came out, and I was like, oh, I love this. I can't pass up the opportunity to talk about a Marvel movie I love with Erin. So we did that instead, and this got postponed. So we're going to do that discussion next week, and I can't wait. It's one of my favorite popcorn movies of all time. I think it's just so evocative of like that classic escapist entertainment. It's one of those movies that I always say is I don't remember like what critics had to say about it back then, and they were probably quite positive about it, but I've always said that that's a movie that is critic proof, because it's just that kind of entertainment that is just so splendid and enjoyable. So yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun. And then the week after that,
the week after that, we were planning to take it off because there was going to be the Super Bowl, and we are still going to take that Sunday off. But a certain event happened earlier this week that caused us to shake up our plans a little bit.
Oh yeah, we actually have news to announce. This is not just repeating ourselves. Okay, so yeah, the next week we were going to take it off, and we still technically are taking that Sunday off, as Jared just said, because hey, it's the Super Bowl, and nobody's gonna unless there's some fellow people who don't, like me, don't like sports. But Jared, you are a sports guy, so I wouldn't do that to you anyway.
Yeah, I was actually just talking with Erin on Twitter about football before we got on this stream, so I know I'm not alone on that.
Yeah, you would have, if I had tried to force you into that, you might have just glowered at me. But I don't know, for the reason I might have gotten away with it, but we're going to change it up. We're doing this Saturday that week, and we are going to be doing a retrospective stream on the first two seasons of Star Wars: The Bad Batch. Why, you ask, other than the fact that The Bad Batch is an amazing show, but why are we doing this on a week that we said we were going to take off, and we're in fact having a special streaming date just for this? Why not just wait? Well, folks, it's because Star Wars: The Bad Batch is coming back for its 3rd season next month, and we will be doing that stream on for the season 3 premiere on February 25th, because that is the Sunday after the premiere, when they will be dropping 3 episodes, and we are going to have a blast talking about that. So yeah. So on February 10th, which is a Saturday, we will be talking about the first 2 seasons of The Bad Batch. Which again, who knows how many people will watch this?
We're gonna be happy as clams talking about that show, no matter how many people are watching.
I haven't had that much luck with Star Wars animation in the past, in terms of especially The Bad Batch, which is like it has its audience, and the people who love The Bad Batch, like ourselves, we really love it. And we're going to be talking very passionately about that show. So as you say, if it's just us and nobody else watches, so be it. So that'll be on February 10th. Then the week after that, we'll be back to normal on Sundays, February 18th, and Erin will be back. And we're going to have Cecilia from Geeksterelia on with us as well to talk about season 1 of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. And we don't care how many of you have negative thoughts about that show. We love it, and we're going to talk about that love. So yeah, good, nice to see. How are you feeling? Like, how are you feeling, Jared, about the fact that season 3 is the last? We've talked about that a little.
We've talked about it before. I am just happy that we have it at all. Because as season 2 was ongoing and I was loving it so much, and as we were approaching the end, they hadn't announced a season 3 renewal, and as it became clear from the final events, they left it on sort of a cliffhanger where once that episode happened, I'm like, I knew 2 things deep in my bones. 1, we're getting a season 3, absolutely, and 2, that season's going to be the last season. And sure enough, within a week or 2, they had confirmed that season 3 would be the last season. And to be perfectly honest, I'm fine with it. I'm at peace with it. I love the show so much, but I would rather that the show knows that this is going to be the last season, gets to go out on its terms, tell the story of the clones, tell the story of these characters that we love. And because, as you are well aware, Star Wars animation has not always gotten to go out on its own terms. Unfortunately, though, they did come back and give us Clone Wars saved. There was a long time when it felt like that story was just going to kind of be left open-ended, and I'm glad that that's not the case. I'm glad that Jennifer Corbett and Brad Rao and their amazing team will get to tell the end of the story as they see fit. And as we know, just because characters finish their runs or stories in a Star Wars animated show does not mean that's the last we're ever going to see of them. We just saw that with the Rebels characters in Ahsoka. So I'm going to be very just grateful to experience season 3, knowing that it's, as the trailer says, hey Laura, one last ride.
I was going to hold off on saying this, but seeing as how Laura just dropped in, I will say that we also have a stream for the first week of March planned. That'll be on March 3rd, where we're having Laura as well as Blue Lemons come on. We're going to be talking about the movie The Witch.
Yes, I'm so excited for that one.
Which I know everybody is super excited, and I just saw it for the first time a couple months ago. And it is phenomenal. I loved it. I was thoroughly creeped out. But yeah, no, that's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. So we have actually planned a lot of things out, folks. And we almost we had a problem when The Bad Batch was announced. Because we're like, oh no, we have to rearrange some stuff, because I said to you, Jared, I was like, there's no way we can talk about something else the first week of season 3. We just won't be able to focus. So
yeah, no, but it worked out perfectly. Even having that window to slot in the first 2 seasons retrospective, because we had that week slated to be off. I'm happy to forego that so we can talk about it, because as we joked in the Slack, trusting us to recap the first 2 seasons and talk about 3 episodes of season 3 and keep the stream under 4 hours was not feasible. So.
You suggested that, and I was like, no, that ain't gonna work. But yeah.
But we will, going forward, the Bad Batch will premiere with 3 episodes. We'll talk about those 3 episodes. And then we're going to continue with our other movie discussions, including The Witch. We'll do periodic check-ins on the Bad Batch, maybe like revisit it 2 or 3 more times, including at the end. And that will give us our Star Wars fix for a little bit, because before that trailer dropped, I'd been kind of pushing John to start a big Star Wars rewatch project, and starting with, doing all the remaining live action movies, starting with the original trilogy. And we still want to do that, but I told him, when the Bad Batch comes, that we'll prioritize that. And lo and behold, we spoke it into existence.
I think you said something to the effect, but we'll be safe on that for a while.
Yeah.
You jinxed it, which is good. I'm glad you did, because I did not expect the show to come back this early this year, and I'm very glad it is. So yeah, we will still figure out when to start our Star Wars rewatch project, because that's going to be a big one, because we'll go through all the films. And I do believe we talked about we're going to go ahead and start with the originals.
Yeah.
And then I will say, when I got to go meet up with our friends Nessie and Trish just last week, and we went to a comic shop, and they had a whole bunch of Star Wars toys, and they had like original Star Wars Episode 1 figures, and I in their original boxes in really fantastic condition. I got Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, 2 Padmes, and there was one more. Who else? And Darth Sidious.
Awesome.
And I got them for no other reason. Like, I didn't get them because I thought they'd look good on this shelf or that shelf. I got them because I was in a store with toys, and there were a bunch of Star Wars Episode 1 toys, and I was a little kid again, and I was like, I want that one, I want that one, I want that one, I want that one. So.
Yeah, and as I'm sure you're aware, we've had a lot of anniversaries of movies we love. 25 years for The Phantom Menace this year. Woo, woo.
Yeah, which is why I definitely, we'll find out a way to make sure we're covering, we get that one in this year, because that's a very special anniversary that I want to go ahead and celebrate. And man, boy, this time passed by fast, because I can't believe it's been 25 years since The Phantom Menace.
Yeah, but Natalie Portman still looks as beautiful as ever.
Exactly.
And so
okay. So anything like, now we've gone ahead and announced like stuff that'll take us through half the year. So anything else?
So I'll just do a quick recap of everything, because it was interspersed with our typical banter. So next week, February 4th, we'll have Erin on to discuss The Mask of Zorro. The following week, stream on a special time, that Saturday, February 10th, a retrospective on the first 2 seasons of Star Wars: The Bad Batch. The following week, back to Sunday, February 18th, to discuss the TV show The Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power. The following week, February 25th, discussing the season 3 premiere of The Bad Batch, the first 3 episodes. And then the week after that, Trish and Laura will be on March 3rd to discuss the chilling and awesome horror movie, The Witch. And then future plans beyond that, that's a month out. We'll get to them,
TBD. Unless people are taking notes, they've already forgotten all the other stuff we just said.
Just the Mask of Zorro next week. That's the one you got to
remember. All right, cool. Let's get back into Hugo. there's a, speaking of like knowing our purpose, and you know, and if I could pinpoint a character who, like, unless I'm actually able to pull off the trick of like getting, you know, becoming a director or a film editor or something, I'm thinking that my purpose in life will probably match what Monsieur Rene Tabad, you know, has going on. I absolutely loved this character, and he is played by the fantastic Michael Stuhlbarg. And like the fact that he is such a, you know, film lover and film geek, and he's and his passion, as he puts it, is George Méliès. Like just seeing him act like a fanboy, I was like, that's me. As a matter of fact, I was on Twitter a couple days ago, and somebody posted, you know, when was the first time you saw yourself represented on screen? And I was kind of in a down mood, and I was like, I'm such a weird loner. I don't feel like I've ever seen, you know, myself on screen in that way. But then I was watching this day, I was like, oh no, that's me. It's like being completely happy in the profession where I get to just obsess about films and, you know, talk about the history of movies, and show people around my nerdy room with, you know, all the stuff from my favorite filmmaker. Like that is totally like my ideal version of myself. But no, he's great, and I feel like the movie like turns a page when he comes on, because he's the one who fills us in a lot on the history of Méliès, and really tells, you know, both Hugo and Isabel, you know, a lot about the history of Papa George, and it's just so wonderful. I just love when he comes up behind them when they're reading through the book, and he's like, "You're interested in Méliès," and they quickly, you know, try to shut the book, and they turn it to his picture in the back, and they're like, "It's allowed," and he goes, "Is it?" Which is so great coming from him. And then when they reveal that he's not dead, he's alive, he has this pure laugh that just comes out, and they're in a library, and it's this loud, pure laugh, and it just immediately like warms you to this character.
Yeah, it's a wonderful performance. You know, if you're looking for cinematic avatars, you could do it a lot worse than Michael Stuhlbarg as Rene Tabard. This movie came out in 2011, I didn't see this movie at that time, obviously. Something else came out in 2011 that featured Michael Stuhlbarg in a prominent role, and that was Boardwalk Empire, which it's kind of been lost a little bit to history because it's the HBO show that came out the same year as Game of Thrones, and HBO thought that was going to be their big show, and Martin Scorsese directed the pilot, and it was from the writer of The Sopranos, and it turns out Game of Thrones far eclipsed it, but I mentioned it just because Michael Stuhlbarg plays Arnold Rothstein in that show, and he's a very different old.
Yes. Sidebar to that, I just remember when those two shows came out at the same time, or they were both up, like they were making both pilots at the same time. I'm like, shit, HBO is gonna go with Boardwalk Empire over Game of Thrones because it's got all the ingredients they're looking for, and then when they both went ahead, that was a miracle. But they were both like going at the same time, and it always felt like Game of Thrones was, you know, facing the uphill battle because you got this monster project that's from Martin Scorsese. It's about, you know, gangsters, and, you know, who was it, Terrence Winter, who was involved from The Sopranos, and it was just like, it was this juggernaut. like Game of Thrones never stood a chance, you know, from our point of view. And then lo and behold, and I feel kind of bad because Boardwalk Empire kind of had to wrap up with a very abbreviated season, and but it still went for 5 years. It didn't get the chance to go out necessarily on the way that I wish it would have, and but it's still 5 very strong seasons. But yeah, it's so funny to look back on that now and like how in fear I was of Game of Thrones having to face down Boardwalk Empire. But no, his performances, Arnold Rothstein, oh my God, he was phenomenal. And then this that
was the first thing I saw.
Yeah, this was so different though. It's just he's
so warm, he's so kind, he's so like, you know, sincere in this movie, and in Boardwalk Empire he's very much a cold, ruthless, you know, mob boss. And turns out Michael Stuhlbarg, great actor, can play them both.
Oh God, he's so good. And then he goes into this story of, you know, when Isabel says, Monsieur Tabar, would you like to meet, you know, would you like to meet him? And he goes, oh, but I have met him. And then we go into this wonderful story where, you know, he goes on to, you know, goes to what we'll call the George Méliès film studio, which is you know, I think Tabard says, to me, it was nothing less than an enchanted palace. You know, it's this place that's just made of, you know, glass, and it's beautiful. And, you know, at this point, he's just a little kid, and he goes in there, and Méliès comes up to him all decked out, and, you know, this costume, and he says, if you've ever wondered where your dreams come from, you look around. This is where they're made. And it's just so magical.
Yeah.
Like, you can imagine how magical that would be to tell like a young child, but as the audience, we feel that as well. It's so amazing. And then there's that shot of where you're seeing the set through they've got the tank in front of it so that you've got the water and the fish going, so it looks like an underwater kingdom. It's just, oh God, it's so beautiful.
Yeah, and that is one aspect of the movie that I'm glad that they focused on, the idea that, you know, those were some of the earliest visual effects in movies, you know, like long before the days of CGI or even like, you know, big pyrotechnics displays. Like, they had to do all of this stuff in camera, and the movie, you know, pays homage to that by showing us behind the scenes of, as you know, as you said, how the dreams and the magic were made. And as a reward for doing that, it won Best Visual Effects itself, which I thought was a cool parallel.
I remember getting so excited about that because I don't remember what it was up against, but it was up against some more much more traditional, like, visual effects heavy hitters, and I just remember getting so excited, and that showed the warmth and goodwill towards the movie that Hugo wasn't the film with the narrative of the year, that because the artist was, because, you know, that had gone through all the film festivals. It was the other movie about, you know, the era of silent movie making, but it was in of itself like a silent movie. And so, even though, if you ask me, Hugo's the better movie, but it very clearly, that was the movie that sort of had the story of the year, basically, the narrative, as we say. And so the fact that Hugo, even though it wasn't going to be the movie of the year for the Oscars, the fact that it took home, you know, it had like a mini sweep in the tech categories, I think very much spoke to the strength of the movie and the love that members had for it, as well as Scorsese himself.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a cliche that Hollywood loves to honor movies about itself, which I don't think is fair to this movie, because I think it's great on its own merits. But I do think it might well have won if it wasn't up against another movie in The Artist that was also about the early days of Hollywood, and specifically the transition from the silent movie era to the talking era.
Now that one, I feel, and this is not a stream to bash the Artist. I think it's a very well made movie, but that feels more like that's a purely just a movie about making movies, in my opinion. Whereas this film has a lot more going on in it. But
but again, to be honest, I didn't see The Artist until many years later, and I admire it for what it is, but it's not I would prefer Hugo, having now seen this one. And I will just note, because you were asking what it was up against for Best Visual Effects, it beat Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, it beat Real Steel, it beat Transformers Dark of the Moon, and then the one that could have won, and perhaps should have won, given the fact that it never got honored later, but I'm glad that Hugo ultimately won, it was up against Rise of the Planet of the Apes, the first one with Andy Serkis. So.
Oh wow! That was back in 2011. I will say, I do wish that series had won something, but for one of the later.
One of the subsequent ones where there was they were still figuring the visual effects out at that time. So I think that Hugo was the rightful winner of. And
I was amazed at how beautifully this film stands up. I think that just shows that I think that award was very well merited, because it's been 12, 13 years since the movie came out, and it's still shockingly beautiful, and the special effects hold up remarkably well. And interesting, this was actually Scorsese's first digital film, which naturally it had to be because it was in 3D. And it's probably, I have to imagine, it's his most visual effects intensive movie, because I don't think he's ever done anything else aside from The Irishman, which that's a different kind of visual effects. But good. I'm glad we didn't offend anybody with that, because I don't want to talk bad about that movie, but it's just Hugo is the one that I really loved that year. So.
It's but just within the movie itself, I love that they show us how a lot of those early visual effects were done, and they kind of make that part of the narrative and the story and the magic of movies, and tying it back into the idea that George Méliès started as a stage magician. Hey, we talked about stage magicians last week with The Prestige. Different movie. Very different movie. there's no murder in this one. But I would say that in this case, the ideas of showmanship and illusions and that kind of creating the magic that your eye can see the how it's done, but you don't actually want to see it. They do that so wonderfully in this movie, because they don't have CGI to create the dragons, the rocket ships that are telling these fantastical stories, but they tell them with such earnest heart and commitment that you can just see how someone who's never seen anything like that before, like a young boy like René Tabard, would be just enraptured by it.
And then of course, once the kids learn all this, they conspire to get Tabard to come to the house. And I love what happens then, because of course it's Mama Jean who comes. She doesn't come to the door. It's Isabel that does, but then Mama Jean comes up and she's like, what is all this? And Tabard is under the impression that they've been invited. So it's funny how he tries to excuse himself, but then given an inch, he can't help himself. He's like, Madame, this is to be, our only meeting. Let me just say how much I admire, your husband's work. And then, of course, he slides in, and if I may say so, you're as lovely now as you were in the movies. And her guard drops completely. She's like, well, it was a very long time ago. It's so great. And then she's like, it was, another time. And then this is the part that I love, because even though he should excuse himself because he's been brought there under false pretenses, but then he's like, well, we have a film.
Yeah.
and it's so great. And just, and the romanticism of what follows when, he's, rolling the projector and they're showing the movie, and, and then she talks about how they hand painted, the film to give it color. And then you got, Howard Shore's music, over the whole thing. And it's just so beautiful. And then it ends, and Isabella says, you were beautiful. And then you just hear from the corner, she still is. And it's just, just melts your heart. And then his heart's, Papa George, his heart has been melted. So he's now open to it, and then she says, you've tried to forget the past for so long, and it's brought you nothing but pain. Maybe it's time you try and remember. And
I love that line so much. That's one of my favorite lines in the movie.
It's just, it's so heartwarming, and just, I love the performances in this so much, and like they're all so beautiful, and of course then we get another beautiful flashback sequence just of that shows us more of their start, starting up the company and buying the palace and all this. And by the way, this is where we get our Martin Scorsese cameo as the photographer.
Yep. Tastefully done. Tastefully done.
Oh, I love it. Now he looks like he's from The Prestige right here.
Yes.
And then you get Ben Kingsley narrating over this whole thing, and just I saw this wonderful new invention. They had invented the movies, and it's just so. How he talks about doing like the special effects of like, and this was so amazing because it reminded me of when I was a kid.
Yeah. Because
I would like take the video camera. I even did this for like a school project once when I'm trying to remember I guess this would have been high school, maybe early on in high school, and where you roll footage on something, and then you like have the person who's in the shot freeze, don't move, and then you remove something from the shot. Yeah. And then you have the person start moving, and it's like voila, you've had a special effect of something disappearing. And it was just so cool to see them doing stuff like that with the skeletons and bringing in like the smoke and all that stuff. It's just and that's the thing. It reminds you of being a kid again, and that's what they got to do when they first started off making the movies. But before it became what we think of as the movies today, it was really just doing all these fun little magician's tricks, and using the film medium to achieve that. And in a lot of ways that has continued, but it's in a different form now. The methods are more sophisticated. And I think that's why, and even though I think the like visual effects, computer generated imagery is still very much in that wheelhouse of something that somebody like Méliès would have been excited about. There is something about those tactile special effects that still wows us, I think, for that reason, that it's watching these people get very creative and doing stuff in camera, these tricks that that just, it's like, wow, how'd they do that? And yeah.
Yeah, and it takes a visionary like Méliès to see the potential, and combined with his passion for it is what really helped in this movie's telling of the story of cinema push the medium forward, because there's that little note when he and Mama Jean are walking through the carnival and they happen upon the first motion picture, that train train pulling into the station that we referenced earlier. He mentions that those two brothers had invented the movies, but then he tries to buy a camera from them, and they're like, this is just a fad. It's a passing thing. We're just trying to make a quick buck off of this. We don't, this is just something to, squeeze a few pennies out of these suckers here at the carnival. And no, but it's so much more than that. But it took someone like Méliès to see it,
Yeah. Oh God. And just seeing him, I'll pop up this picture again. The way he looks so happy when he's, making the films, and there's this one shot where he's like holding out his arms and he's like, action, and he's just like, the excitement of that is like, and that's the thing. It makes me kind of, sad, because that's what I would have loved to be a part of, like that ground level of, granted, I say that in the romantic way, but then the flip side of that is then, everything went down the toilet for him, and, his movies weren't popular anymore. And then, he had to deal with, the fallout of all that. But there is something about, the early days of cinema that is just incredibly romantic if you're a cinephile, and even after that, a number of decades ago, I guess it's a few decades ago now, but before things got even bigger, when it was still like the studio systems in Hollywood where you could go to Hollywood and actually, make your way into, some part of the business, that way. But now it's such a huge industry that type of thing is unthinkable. It's just this whole sequence and the way you get to see them staging all the different stuff, or you got like the dragon and, and all the guys with the spears and stuff. And then the dragon breaks down his light, and then he has to go up and he's like, all right, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And it's just, it's so amazing.
Yeah. This might be a great opportunity to talk about Sir Ben Kingsley and just how awesome his performance is in this movie. Oh, sorry, I cut out there for a second. I was just going to say this might be an opportunity to talk about how awesome Sir Ben Kingsley is in this movie, because this moment, this sequence that you're talking about, is really the moment where his character comes alive, and he has essentially like a 5-minute monologue where this movie doesn't work without this scene and this sequence. And this is why you get an actor of Sir Ben Kingsley's, caliber to portray a character like this, because he just sells it with not only the inflections of his voice conveying like the joy and the heartbreak, but also just the glee on his face, coupled with the tragedy when it all starts to fall away. And it's a wonderful performance. And then bringing it back to the end when he, is kind of just sitting the whole while, he's just sitting there quietly with Mama Jean holding his hand. And he's telling this story to this young kid, Hugo, who he had perceived as an annoyance, who he wanted out of his life. And he's the one who brought him back to life in a way. And it's
his line, life has taught me one very big lesson, Hugo, and it's not the one I thought it would. Happy endings only happen in the movies. And To which then Hugo can't wait to rush out and go get the automaton to show him, that there is still something of his. But he's just, Ben Kingsley is so phenomenal, and this sequence is the linchpin of his entire performance, because prior to this, throughout the entire film, we're seeing a man who is in extreme pain and feels that his life has been, wasted, and that he had all these dreams that didn't come to fruition, and everything. And this isn't also, it's not like today where if somebody's, had career highs, but then, it all went down the toilet, you still have like records of the work you've done and the acclaim you received for that work and whatnot. As far as he's concerned, he had to sell his film and have it, it was melted down to make shoes. The shoe heels, as a matter of fact.
That's such a brutal, evocative detail. Yeah.
Yeah, and so for him, he's been completely forgotten, and there's no trace that anything he ever did, from his perspective, was of any worth at all. And for an artist, you just have to imagine that is so incredibly heartbreaking. And then I love his line when he's being celebrated, at the end, where he says, "I am standing here because of one very brave young man," as someone who saw a broken machine, and against all odds, he fixed it. It's so beautiful. And so just to go through the entire movie, and where he's playing this character who at first glance is very abrasive, cruel even, but then you see what has brought him to that, and then you get this whole sequence where he narrates the story of his life, and you get to see him with all this joy and and love, and it just completely turns the character in a way so that then when you go back and when you watch the rest of the movie, your heart just breaks for him. And it's again, like, I got called out on my view on the Oscars by Erin, who of course said that I'll talk I'll talk a tough game about how awards don't matter, but then I'll still get I'll still wind up discussing him and stuff. So I'll admit to that. But it really, it sucked that he wasn't nominated for this role, because I thought he absolutely deserved it. And but the good thing is, that was like 12, 13 years ago, and now, we're still left with a phenomenal performance, not only by him, but as you said before, this film is filled with so many astounding performances.
Yeah, and he is like very much at the heart of it in terms of the love letter to cinema aspect that we've touched on throughout the movie. But he's also at the emotional heart of Hugo's story, because ultimately the form of that healing that Hugo inspires in him, and that causes him to reconnect to what he loves, it comes back because he's the one who ends up vouching for Hugo and giving Hugo a home at the end of the movie. Like, Hugo has kind of forged this connection with Isabel throughout the movie, and it's not really implied like whether or not it's meant to be like a little bit of a romantic connection or if it's more of a sibling connection. It's not really important at that age. It's just these two have like bonded clearly. And at the end, George Méliès, he opens his heart and he takes Hugo in to his family, his life, and his story. And when Isabel was writing down, the story of Hugo at the end, like, you feel like even though Hugo is, I believe, a fictional character, whereas George Méliès was a very real person. It doesn't feel like this movie is like taking liberties with history or anything. It's a story, and in this case, it happens to be the story of how two broken people healed each other, and in the process, pulling back the curtain on a man who was someone to whom all fans of cinema owe a great debt.
Well, I believe it's often said, "Don't let truth get in the way of a good story."
Which we agree.
Yeah.
At least in
and here's the thing, on numerous occasions since this movie came out, they have released and re-released copies of the film shown in this, the one with the man in the moon, and I'm trying to remember what the actual film is called.
It's a French title. Le Voyage dans la Lune. So.
Yeah. Anyway, so they've released that numerous times. That's because of the attention it brought to Méliès and to that film by this film, Hugo, and that right there shows like how successful this movie was at renewing interest, in both Méliès and the older days of cinema. This is how you get people to be exposed to stuff that they otherwise might brush aside and think, well, it came out almost close to 100 years ago, so what do I care? And you bring those stories back by telling this kind of story, which is not just a documentary. It's not just learn about this filmmaker George Méliès. It's its own amazing story that then shines a light on even older stories and brings that back into the public consciousness, and shows how how far we've come with technology, but in some ways it's all rooted in the same thing, this magic that's in the movies, which is, as we've discussed, is a major theme of this movie. And I just think that's wonderful. And it's one of the reasons why when this film came out, I was so wowed by it, just because, I think it showed, it wasn't just about showing the old days of cinema. It was about understanding what was so powerful about cinema in those early days, and showing that it's not far removed from that same excitement that we get now, and beyond that, that's not like, that's a major part of the story, but that's not the story in of itself. That we have this very emotional story about a young man who is, just seeking for family, trying to find a way of not being alone, and then in turn, you're meeting other people who are going through that themselves, and and as Méliès attributes to him, fixing them along the way. And it's such a beautiful, amazing story that is extremely touching. And if it educates people about an older filmmaker along the way, then that's even better. But it's just so much more than any of those things by themselves. And yeah, it's why it's like, and you mentioned, when you texted me the other day, I didn't want you to watch this movie so it would magically become your favorite Martin Scorsese film. I didn't, that wasn't like my goal. And I think that's a tall order for anybody, because I know a lot of people love Scorsese for, there's many films that come before this one in their sort of list of all-time greats. But I am such a passionate lover of cinema and of emotional storytelling. Something that this movie, I feel, has that a lot of Scorsese films don't have is an emotional, like, element, a really emotional story, because you take a movie like Goodfellas, which is incredibly interesting. The characters are superb, but it's also about the craft of the movie making and the editing and and the script and things like that. And it's about, wow, that was cool, and it gave me a rush, and there's so much that's very effective and powerful in that way about that film. But Hugo represents the kind of story that has always been most appealing to me. It's something that really appeals to the heart, and and makes you emotionally engaged with the characters on screen, which is a Scorsese that I feel like we don't always get.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's why I respond so much to this movie. But I certainly was not. It was more about, I knew you would appreciate this film. It was not about me converting you to be like, oh yes, this is the best of all his films. But no, I am very happy that you watched it, and so we could talk, because it certainly does sound like you got a lot out of it.
No, I did, and I'm very grateful for the recommendation, because this is a movie that I always thought I would enjoy. It's just, there are a lot of movies that that we all have on our personal catch-up list, and this one never quite rose to the top until the opportunity arose for us to talk about it on this stream. But now I've seen it, and I really, really do sincerely love it, and I would and I'm happy to have a new piece of Scorsese's filmography to understand, because yes, I would say that I probably still would favor something like Goodfellas or Raging Bull or Taxi Driver as on a personal list. Those are all very bleak movies, though. Yes. And I can see, especially when we've talked about the idea of movies that kind of see the world as a dark place that you kind of have to feel your way through, versus a place where life life and heart and hope can win out. It's tough. The movie that Martin Scorsese just got nominated for this year, Killers of the Flower Moon, masterfully done movie, very, very bleak, that makes you just want to reckon with the horrors of the world. It's a movie I admire a great deal. I don't know when I'll get around to watching it again. I hope I will, but it's a different kind of thing. It actually, weirdly, the movie that this movie in Martin Scorsese's filmography reminds me the most of, in the sense it's kind of an outlier that people don't think about as much, but is extraordinarily well done, is actually The Age of Innocence. That's a movie I love, and it's not one that's often considered as one of Martin Scorsese's best. But I had read the book, and that's Daniel Day-Lewis and Winona Ryder and Michelle Pfeiffer, and it's a sweeping romantic drama. And you're like, if you ask people to pick who's the director of this movie, most of them would not say Martin Scorsese. But that's because people kind of have an idea of this is what a Martin Scorsese movie should be. And for one of the greatest living filmmakers, it's kind of limiting to say that, he can only make gangster movies. That's really not the case, even though he's great at them. The Departed too. The Departed, is what he won his Oscar for. That's a fanatically entertaining movie. It's another one of those movies that kind of leaves you at the end feeling like the world's fucked.
I always
you feel much differently about this.
I always I came to regret it, but that was not the film that I would personally have picked for him to win Best Director. But I
don't think anyone did, but it was time.
Yeah.
So
I wish that he had either won a couple years before for The Aviator, or that they had gone and waited a couple more years for this. But I also recognize that a lot of people probably wanted him to win one for something that was in what they considered to be his wheelhouse, of a gangster movie. But as far as movies that this reminded me of, I do see, what you mean about The Age of Innocence, and I do have that movie. There's a beautiful Criterion collection edition of the film that came out a number of years ago, which I had never seen the movie before. But it looked really good, so so I went and bought it, and I did not regret that decision. And of course, Daniel Day-Lewis and Michelle Pfeiffer. That's all I needed to know. But the film that for me, I see a lot of connections with, not necessarily in the tone of the story, but it's The Aviator. Just because there's a lot of similarities with the cinematography, especially in the early parts of The Aviator, which have like the color scheme of like older, Hollywood movies and photography and the fact that both movies are consumed with like The Aviator is the golden age of Hollywood, so it's very much about cinema and movies, and so you've got that element with this, and it just feels like those two movies are kind of, I feel like that's a particular kind of Scorsese style that carries over in both films, and ironically I think those probably are my two favorite Scorsese movies, which is very different, I know, from some that other people would mention, although there are a lot of gaps in my Scorsese watch list of things that I need to catch up on, particularly his earlier work. So,
me too.
So who knows? Maybe that'll change. But I think it's because I'm, especially as regards to Hugo, even though ask people, I like my dark cinema because there's a lot of creativity and and passion that can come from making those kinds of stories. But I think in my heart of hearts, I still crave stories and films that have an optimistic view of humanity. It's the reason why, as much as I adore Game of Thrones, and we're talking all 8 seasons, folks, and I will defend the fact that that season 8 is so great because it shows the bad side of humanity and how we can still, like, we can overcome the great evil, but then we're left to contend with ourselves, and that's when we're really screwed. So I can simultaneously talk about that and praise those elements while going, but my heart is still going to yearn always for Lord of the Rings, because that is, it's just a different kind of story. And it says that, there are, not that there aren't complex, there are, I would argue, very complex characters in the Lord of the Rings, but it has a optimistic, positive view of humanity and what we can accomplish when we work together, and the bonds of like friendship and love and those types of things. I think it just fits with the kind of person that I am, that I'm always going to gravitate towards that element of stories, and which is probably why, and that is probably why, Hugo is the type of movie that appeals to me in Scorsese filmography over the movies where he, really gets down in the muck with the worst of the human condition. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, there's absolutely nothing that says that stories that are designed to be hopeful, designed to be optimistic, that are designed to lift up your heart, maybe even speak to your heart a little bit more than your head. That the idea that those have to be lesser, it's not an accurate or fair depiction. It's something where they're different types of storytelling, and they're part of the things that like cinema can give us in terms of wanting to show us the world as it is and the world as it could be, and we just want to where the two meet in the middle. And this is the type of movie where its kind of aspirational quality is one of its selling points, because it does ultimately have a happy ending, and it leaves most of its characters in a good place, and it's a positive and affirming story, but that doesn't mean it's, like it's got elements of tragedy. It's got, it's got, it starts with the boy losing his father, and a man losing his entire livelihood and passion, and so like, and that's the kind of adversity that you need to tell a good story, even a children's story. This being a children's book, I think that might be part of the reason that people are like, well, why would Scorsese want to make this? This is why, because it's a human story, not just because it's, he wanted to make a hagiography of George Méliès. If that was all he was interested in, he could have done a documentary on the man. He's a great documentary filmmaker too. He wanted to tell this story because it ultimately, the themes and the heart of it is the what makes this movie truly special and allows you to connect with the idea of this is why this man was important, and this is why this boy's story was worth telling. I referenced earlier the story, at the end, Isabel sitting down to write the story of, Hugo Cabret, and how like his adventure, led him to this, in search for a message to his father, led him all the way home. That's a beautiful idea, and it's something that, it's not a fairy tale thing. Like, I think J.R.R. Tolkien would have ideas about people who want to denigrate the idea of fairy tales. His essay on fairy stories is one of the best pieces of like critical analysis of fantasy literature ever written, for a reason.
Yeah, if any of you haven't read that, it's called On Fairy Stories, read it. It is just, it's a quick read. It's not very long. But it is just one of the best essays on storytelling you'll ever read. And speaking of which, along the lines of what we're talking about, you said like this story has dark elements, but that's what makes the fact that it is ultimately very affirming of human decency and has a happy ending. Like, that's what makes that work so well. It's, even in the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien called it the eucatastrophe, where things are darkest and then the explosion of of light and and resolution, and it gives you a really happy ending, but it also, like, things are all the more rewarding because you've gotten to that dark place, just before the dawn. And so this movie has to deal with, great sadness and, stories of grief and of loss. And so that when we do get that happy ending, it feels so rewarding and uplifting and satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole idea of eucatastrophe, I'm glad you mentioned it, because, it's the idea that like this calamity, this unforeseen, calamity or event, like the Deus Ex Machina, it doesn't have to always be tragic. It can be, something positive. It can be a happy chance that leads to great joy. And this movie has kind of a small moment of that. And coincidentally enough, there is a Lord of the Rings connection, because this movie also features a very small but very potent performance by one Sir Christopher Lee as Monsieur Lebes, the librarian. And he is kind of an introduction to, he has a connection with Isabel because she is so, he's a librarian. She borrows books from him. He's kind of her gateway into the larger world of stories and imagination and adventure, because she hasn't seen the cinema because of Papa George's, trauma. He doesn't want her going to the movies. Her escape is books. And that scene where they talk about, Jules Verne and Robin Hood is great. But it leads into one of my absolute little favorite moments in the movie, which is when Hugo's coming back into the train station and he bumps into Monsieur Lebes, and he's carrying that book. I believe it's Robin Hood. And he says, this was meant for, I think it was like my nephew, but it's clear now it was meant for you. that's eucatastrophe. That's a happy accident, but it's also, it feels like destiny because this was Hugo's story, and he is, he was never an extraneous part in the machine. He had his part to play, and this was an element of that,
And that's how that whole conversation begins, because Isabel, talks about how oh God, sorry, what was Christopher Lee's character, Monsieur Labisse, how he's always sending books to a good home. And, and they talk about how that's his purpose. And I love that, and of course, any appearance by Christopher Lee, it's just, and this was when, and you can tell he's getting quite up in years. This is when he was getting a bit slower, but remarkably still before he filmed his appearances in the Hobbit films, which I'll never get over how robust he actually came off in those movies. And I know for the fighting stuff, obviously, those are doubles and stuff, but even and here we go, a preview of our Hobbit streams to come. But like when he's in that, the White Council meeting in the first Hobbit film, and he's arguing with Gandalf, I'm like, and then you saw him in like behind the scenes interviews. I just always found it so amazing how even someone who he was obviously having trouble, at that age, and he would talk very slowly, but man, when those cameras rolled and he had to be Saruman or any other character, it's like, it just, all of a sudden he was Christopher Lee, the actor, and he could just turn it on. And yeah, it's, I can't say, like, part of me wants to be like, sadly we lost him, but oh my God, what a full life he led. I don't think he had any regrets about what he accomplished.
And not just his acting career. If you go look at Christopher Lee's life story and everything that he accomplished, like, the man was a spy, the man was a war hero, the man was a hard metal, like, death metal musician, he was freaking Count Dracula in addition to being Saruman. It's like, this man rocks. he was one of the coolest people ever to live.
Yeah, oh my God. There's a couple things that I want to mention that I think we didn't talk about. There's a scene where the station inspector is interrogating Hugo, and this again is what I'm talking about with, like, I wish you could have seen this in 3D, Jared, because there's a point where he starts like peering in at Hugo, and it's just his face on the screen, and he keeps getting, his face is closer and closer to the camera, to the point where he's peering off the edge of the screen practically, and you just feel like he's like, you needed to lean back in your seat because it felt like he was being so intrusive. And so that was another beautiful 3D moment. And then a scene we didn't really talk about is when Hugo and Isabel are investigating, about the drawing after the automaton has done the drawing, and they go into, they go back to Isabel's home and go through, the cabinet and pull out a box, and it's so great when the chair breaks and everything.
You knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, this is another moment where the 3D really shined, because you got all these papers flying around the room and like spinning and showing the drawings and stuff, and it was just astounding in 3D. And then of course Papa George comes in, and it's another amazing example of Ben Kingsley's acting, because especially when he picks up a couple of the drawings and he starts ripping them up, and Mama George is like, stop, George, this is your work. And he's like, my work? What am I? A bunch of old drawings, and I forget exactly what he says, but it's just so heartbreaking. And so when you see him go from that to later in the film, when he's once again able to embrace the past. It's just, God, his character arc throughout the movie is just breathtaking.
Yeah, he's a wonderful actor. They all are, and that moment, just kind of at the end when you had alluded to the fact that he, like, when the Inspector Gustav, after several close encounters with Hugo throughout the movie, there's the scene where he almost catches him, and Isabel has her lovely little moment where she's reciting poetry, and and she I forget the name of the poetess, excuse me, Christina Rossetti, yes, who she named her cat after, which is a lovely little touch. But
I know the rest of it. I'm very fond of poetry, especially that one.
But not in the train station. The train station, there's no place for poetry. But just when it leads into the ending of the movie, the idea of Hugo, as I think we alluded to, once George Méliès has opened his heart, and Hugo realizes that the automaton belongs to him and he is still in possession of it, because of course that was the one thing that Papa George could not bring himself to destroy from his previous work. And he rushes back to go find him, and that's of course when he gets caught by the inspector, and it looks like he's going to lose everything, and we get the scene.
Which, by the way, this was a wonderful callback, of course, to the film that they go see in the theater earlier in the movie. What is that? The Kid? Is that the name of the movie? I think. I don't. I think it might be. I really should have pulled up the credits of all the films that they showed throughout the film. But yeah. In any case, it was a beautiful callback, and poor poor guy. I know he's chasing after Hugo, and we're not rooting for him to catch him, but the fact that he goes all the way up with that poor leg of his, and takes him a while. But he gets there.
Yep, and then he has to head right back down. But yeah, of course, the scene where Hugo is hanging off the face of the clock tower is the poster for the movie, and that's a very evocative image that not only is just a fun action adventure beat, but is another connection to early cinema, as you said.
Yeah.
But when it comes back to the idea of he's trying to get back to Papa George with the automaton, and he falls onto the train track, and there's that scene where he had that nightmare earlier in the movie, where the train ran him over and the train smashed through the station, and that comes back in this moment, and it looks like it's going to end in tragedy, but that's not the type of movie this is. Maybe if this was a gangster movie, he would have been run over. But Inspector Gustav saves him, pulls him off the track with the automaton. But of course, the automaton breaks during that process. And that scene where George comes with Isabel, and he encounters Gustav, and he gives that wonderful moment where Gustav's like, this boy doesn't have anyone, he needs to go to the orphanage, and George says, this boy belongs to me. And which is it's a wonderful hell yes moment. And then it's topped only by just a few seconds later when Hugo's distraught because he's like, the automaton, it's broken, and Papa George says, no, it isn't, it worked perfectly. So
which, by the way, that was the part that today that had me tearing up big time. It's God.
Yeah.
So good.
Anyway, so happy endings, yeah.
And then I just love the ending scene after there's been the big, gala, of George's movies, and Tabad, talks about they were able to recover 80 films from vaults, barns, any place film was being stored, and restore a lot of it and save it. And so after that wonderful sequence, which again makes beautiful use of the 3D, because there's that shot where George gets up and he goes, "Come and dream with me," and then he puts on the hat, steps out of frame, and then it goes to the Méliès in the actual film, and then all those films are shown to us in 3D, and you got the moon coming out into the audience, which is so great. But then we have the final scene of the movie, which has so many great little touches, because now George is part of like the film academy, and so it shows like him and Renee and a couple other guys like geeking out about talking about the early days of cinema and like what to study, and you can just see Renee being like in total like fantasy land, like he could not be any happier. This is like his dream come true. And then you get the bit with Gustav, where he's talking about Hugo actually made a new, part for his legs so that he can sit up and down, and so great, and so and he's gotten together.
Gustav is now mastered 3 smiles, not just one.
Yeah,
that's a lovely little.
Which one? I mastered 3. Yeah, and it's just beautiful. And then you cap it off with hearing Isabel, narrate the story that she's writing. I think a good place to end this is talking about why the book is actually called, the book not being the book she's writing, but the book that this movie was based on is called The Invention of Hugo Cabret. Because if you actually see the book, I actually own a copy. It's does have like text like a traditional book, but it is also massively drawings, almost like storyboards. And so it's a very thick book, but so much of that is just like storyboard images where you flip through page after page, and that's how you see a lot of the scenes and a lot of the action in it. And then it's interspersed with actual text. But you come to the end of the book, and spoil alert for anybody who maybe didn't want to know the big surprise of the book, but you come to the end of the book, and it's revealed that Hugo has built his own automaton, which creates copies of the book that you're holding. And so the book you're actually reading itself is the invention of Hugo Cabret.
Oh, nice.
And so I think that's a beautiful, wonderful conceit right there. And a note on the title, because we talked about that earlier. I know that in some international markets, the film actually was called Hugo Cabret, as opposed to just Hugo. I don't know, whatever the title, I absolutely love this movie, and yeah, it's just one of my favorite films, and definitely my favorite movie that celebrates cinema. So, yeah. Any final comments?
Yeah, I think the only thing in response to.
Oh, you're freezing up.
I want to kind of give a little bit one more shout out to the character of Isabel, just because I thought that she was again one of the highlights of the movie, with Chloe Grace Moretz's performance and her little affectations, including her tendency to use, elevated vocabulary like, "Oh, this is stupendous. This is superlative. It's a story full of circumlocutions." It's just like, it could have been annoying, but she just makes it such a little charming affectation. But she also can be very sparse with her words when she needs to be. And I love that scene when after they get back from the cinema and they're parting ways for the time, and she just simply says to Hugo, "Thank you for the movie today. It was a gift." And it's such a wonderful little beat, and that's honestly kind of like how I feel about this movie, because you were insistent on that we get to this at some point, and I'm very happy that I watched it. This movie was a gift indeed, and I'm glad that I've seen it now. So thank you.
No, well, I will in turn thank you, because this is one that I've wanted to talk about ever since I first started the channel. But unfortunately, in our circle, not a lot of people have seen it, and so it's just a question of finding somebody to watch it with. And AR and I had never quite gotten around to it, so I very much appreciate you watching the movie and doing this with me. And I thought it was a lovely discussion. And I also really want to thank all of you guys who tuned in for the chat, because I did think there was a possibility that Jared and I would just be sitting here talking to ourselves. But it's really rewarding to see that there are some other people out there who love this movie too. So thank you very much for coming and watching. So if there's nothing else, we'll wind down and start and just do a recap of what's coming up. I think that was a very good note to end on. Do you have anything else?
Nope, that's it. Other than we'll going forward, we're gonna be doing a lot of like big projects. We're going to be making recurring trips to places like Middle Earth and the galaxy far, far away that we love. Big sprawling stories that have a lot of different installments we can talk about. But I do hope we continue to find the time to talk about just personal favorites like this one, because that's part of what keeps everything fresh, because ultimately this all comes from the heart.
Well, I do owe you one now, so the next thing like this will be one of the ones that I know we've got some written down on on our schedule. That said, I was.
It'll be a ways off.
Well, no. I was going to say, once I do that, we do the next one for you. There was another movie that I added to the list because I was thinking about it the other day, and it's another one that not a lot of people have seen, and I'm not sure whether you've seen it or not. It's a very different Napoleon movie from the one that was out this year. It's called The Emperor's New Clothes. It came out in 2001, and it starred Ian Holm as Napoleon. Have you seen it?
I have not. I have to admit, funnily enough, when I saw you enter it onto the Google Doc, and I'm glad that you put the year, because when I saw it, you know what my mind went to? It went to The Emperor's New Groove, the Disney movie, because that came out I think like a year earlier, and I was like, John wants to talk about The Emperor's New Groove? But no, I have not seen The Emperor's New Clothes starring Ian Holm, but that would be another one I'll have to check out. I don't know if it's streaming anywhere, because to be honest, like with a lot of those movies,
I don't think it is, but it is available to rent on iTunes, and it is actually. I remember looking at a number of years ago, and I don't think it was in HD, and it finally is in HD. So even though I can't buy a Blu-ray of it, at least I'll be able to watch it in high def on streaming. I still have the DVD that came out for it when it was released, because I think the reason why it actually, for a small film, it actually got a relatively good release. And that was due entirely to the fact that it originally came out in 2001, but it got a release in American cinemas in 2002, and that was down to The Lord of the Rings, and because people knew him as Bilbo. So yeah, it's a very small, relatively unknown film. So that's one that I would like to get to one day. No rush on that because we got a lot of stuff on our plates, and also I owe you the next one, for movies that that I haven't seen. So yeah, we'll get to it.
We'll talk about it. I know that one that I've thrown out a couple times, and I definitely would love to get a chance to talk about it, would be the Before trilogy, Richard Linklater's Before trilogy, and probably the first movie, Before Sunrise. That would probably be my pick. But we'll talk.
Okay.
Again, ways off.
Cool. Not gonna repeat the whole list of stuff that we've got coming out because you guys can go back to the mid-roll for that. But next week we will be talking about The Mask of Zorro with our good friend Erin. She'll be coming on. And then the week after that we'll be streaming on Saturday instead of Sunday to talk about seasons 1 and 2 of The Bad Batch. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to both of those as well as the other stuff that we have coming up. Mask of Zorro is going to be a lot of fun next week. I will. There will have to be time set aside within the stream to just.
There will be a dedicated thirst section because Catherine Zeta-Jones is going to require at least 10 minutes, and I'm sure Antonio Banderas will as well. So.
We will be as respectful as we possibly can be because they all give amazing performances in the film. But boy, when I was 13 or I guess 14 years old, seeing this and Catherine Zeta-Jones came on screen, let's just say my world changed. Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll save the rest of that for next week. And thank you again, guys, for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Hope you had a good time. I know I did, and thank you, Jared. I'm really happy you enjoyed this movie, and I thought this was a really fun conversation. So thank you. By the way, wouldn't be me if I didn't close out the stream with going ahead and urging you to buy the Arrow Video special edition of Hugo that has the film in 4K and 3D as well as the 2D version, and a whole bunch of new bonus features, including interviews with a whole bunch of the crew, composer Howard Shore, and a lot of the Brian Selznick also, who wrote the book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret. He's interviewed in this as well. New audio commentary track. It's got the works. So just, if you like the movie, go on and get it. And then, of course, I also have to show off the soundtrack that I have because, it's on brand. All right, folks. Thank you. And hope you guys have a wonderful night. And we will see you next week for The Mask of Zorro. Until then, see you later. Bye.